Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. Still wrapped in so many layers of turbulent, consequential change, it's hard to keep track. In the United States, we have our political issues, understatement alert, and there are geopolitical issues. There's still war, and there's starvation, and there's the internet, there's the explosive changes with AI. I'm really happy to connect with Cass Sunstein because he's written about so many issues that are percolating, not just percolating, but overflowing right now. That uh, it's hard. It'd be hard not to reach out to him. He has a recent book out, "Climate Justice: What Rich Nations Owe the World and the Future," which will be the prime focus here. But you also have a book out on AI, and I just was at a dinner recently up here in Maine, where a guy who runs Bechtel Corporation was sitting, and we were talking about how much these giant companies are calling on firms like Bechtel to build massive installations all around the world rapidly to satisfy our demand for not just information, but someone else's intelligence. So it's great to see you. Anyone who doesn't know, you're an economist, long timer at Harvard, and I've got some pictures of some of your previous books. You have another one coming out called Manipulation later this summer. We talk about that in a few minutes. So anyway, the first step is to ask you how you're doing amid the nonstop, consequential, Trump-driven flood the zone moment we're in.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a great admirer of yours, so an honor to get to talk to you. And I'm doing great. I mean, the sun is shining. I have children, I have dogs, I have a wife who seems to like me, and life is good.
That's good. God, I could tick down that same list. I also have my music, which is absolutely keeps me sane. Been writing a few songs about the current situation we're in too, which is a way to get around the strictures of journalism. So again, we're going to focus on climate. Obviously, I've been writing about this since the mid 1980s, and now here I am approaching my 70th year, and certain things have not changed very much. Lots is changing. The cost of renewable energy is explosively plummeting. Uh, Coal use is declining, sort of. And but we still have these spasms of politics. We had, and that you were directly involved in. There was Obama, then Trump, and then Biden, and then Trump. And your book focuses on the word justice, which we'll talk about a little bit. And I thought I would just start by asking you, what drove you into this particular question? Obviously, social cost of carbon, which you worked on under the Obama administration, is a prime way to frame this. How much do we value and cost the impacts and emissions around climate? So why this book and why now?
Well, it started, I think, in around 2006, before there were, advanced technologies, before there was the telephone even, or television, or 2006, before human beings really had clothes. Actually, a long time ago, 2006. And what got me interested in it was there were discussions all over the world about whether wealthy countries owed obligations to poor countries, whether an agreement should involve payments to poor countries, whether there was some sort of tort being committed by wealthy nations on poor nations. And I did some academic writing on that. And then, as you say, in the Obama administration, we developed a social cost of carbon and questions about whether that number should reflect the damage done to Americans by American practices, or reflect the damage done to the world by American practices. And that was discussed in the Obama administration with energy and commitment, and it became the basis for lawsuits. It's been theoretically, engaged by people who are really, really good. And that issue was kind of the anchor for the book. Also thinking in the context of current discussions where poor countries are saying, help,
Right.
an exclamation point. And I'm not going to quote John Lennon, but they're making claims of justice about, you benefited from uses of coal and other sources of greenhouse gases, and we're suffering, and now you want us to scale back and you want us to pay for the cost, and you
Right.
kind of shouldn't do that. So that was definitely a proximate cause of all.
Yeah. And going back to the end of that era, you and Michael Greenstone, who'd worked with you on the social cost of carbon estimates and pulled together that working group for Obama, you kind of wrote a letter here, an open letter to Donald Trump uh, about not negating the costs of climate change. And of course, what's happened since, I keep thinking about Fahrenheit 451, the novel and the movie, when I think about what the EPA now is celebrating deregulation. So it's like they've replaced fire hoses with flamethrowers.
Yeah.
And what does that feel like to do all that work and to feel, talk about the clarity to you of the question, the issue, and then what you've seen here was Trump 2.0.
Okay, so there's the Obama social cost of carbon number, and then Trump 1 cut it way, way down from approximately $51 per ton to approximately $3 or $4 per ton. And that, my own feelings were not jumping for joy and excited. My thinking, as opposed to feelings, were what's that based on? And it was based on a decision to use the domestic number to say the damage done by American companies to Americans is all that counts. And I thought that was just a mistake. And I thought it was illegal as well as a mistake. And it was struck down in court as illegal. Then the EPA now is going after the endangerment finding, which happened on my watch. I spent a lot of time on that. The endangerment finding that climate change endangers public health or welfare, that's extremely straightforward, and it allows a lot of flexibility for regulatory responses. So it's fair to say elections have consequences, and on fuel economy or energy efficiency, the Trump administration certainly can depart from the Obama and Biden administrations. That's completely fair. The endangerment finding, which there's a proposed repeal, it feels a little surreal to me because it was very hard to justify, and the justification was, what's the right way to put it? Not solid. That's a soft way to put it. A harder way to put it is the lawyers didn't play the standard function in making sure this is legally good, and the scientists and the economists weren't very, very much at their best. Let's say that. So let's just put to one side the human and non-human animal terribleness of not doing anything about climate change. It's just government without responsibility, I guess. So this was not a good moment for the EPA to do things that would be deregulatory. I actually favor that in many domains. I think deregulation should have happy stars next to it much of the time, certainly not all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
This is not going to survive judicial review unless they improve it a lot. So you try to do things when you're privileged to serve the American people that are lawful, and this certainly isn't there yet. They can do some things about fuel economy and energy efficiency that would save money and reduce costs, that would be responsible and lawful. I wouldn't favor them, by the way, or at least there are versions of them I wouldn't favor.
Right.
But this step is a little bit not just a little bit, it's reckless, I regret to say.
Yeah, it seems to be the approach to break things first and then worry about any of the details later. Right there with Elon Musk's help earlier on USAID and the like. One more reflection before we dive more into the book. I wrote a piece during during Biden's term, warning about this is before the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, warning about the sort of governance by executive order. And I said it's basically like building fancy sandcastles, having this nice climate policy, but having it vulnerable to the bullies who get the beach. And then even the IRA, of course, has proved not to be immune to the bullies on the beach. So it's not even just governing by executive order. And as you say, some of Trump's executive order moves will be challenged, et cetera. But there's a lot of damage in the short term as well that can linger and build.
I might say it's, since I worked for 4 years under President Obama on executive action, and I had a climate resilience role under President Biden at the Department of Homeland Security, I should say that there's a ton that's done through executive action that endures, and it might literally endure in the sense that the energy efficiency and fuel economy and other things might be more stable than appears. Even if it's swept away, as you say, the company's actions involve plans that extend over long periods. So you might say to the companies, you don't have to be as aggressive on greenhouse gas reducing steps, but they've already built their plans. And the plans might not be as aggressive as they would be under, let's say, Biden or Obama, but they would be more aggressive than Trump allows them to be, because the business model is relatively stable. And so we're not going to see American companies under President Trump being as, let's say, unresponsive to the climate change problem as they would have been had the executive action not occurred. And I saw this close up where American companies were either upbeat about new technologies or energy efficiency or electric vehicles, or at least open to that. And the executive action created a path which wouldn't be the same under Trump as it would be under Biden. And, in some ways it might be better. We need to get into the details, but it wouldn't be as polluting as it would otherwise be without the executive action. So I'm in complete agreement with what you said here. I'm also pretty upbeat about the effects of executive action, even if the executive action doesn't stay on the books forever.
That's good to hear. And of course, technology, these things keep changing. The investments that were made in renewables over a long period of time have really played dividends that even in Iowa and Texas are renewable energy leaders. It has nothing to do with their politics. So that momentum is there. So back to the book. I think a big theme here is trying to figure out how to go global with our valuations and investments and policies. You call it climate change cosmopolitanism in one part of the book, and it's one of your messages. That's really hard to do. Having covered the climate talks since before there were climate talks, and not just within those talks, all of our visions of kind of, whether you call it global governance or global management, seem to stay in the realm of vision. So what's the hope here? And just sort of articulate that idea of cosmopolitanism and how to really keep that global view in mind going forward.
Okay, so there's one version of that long syllable word that's moral, and there's another version that's about domestic self-interest. And I'm very conscious that in speaking about cosmopolitanism of any kind, it's a little like releasing a folk music album the week after Bob Dylan went electric, that the timing isn't so great. It's not where the zeitgeist is at this moment, but folk music has endured, and let's hope that, and had some rebirths. So let's hope that we'll see something similar for cosmopolitanism. Okay, the moral version says, look, if a country emits pollution that harms another country, it's committing a moral wrong and it should stop and compensate the losers. So if Mexico polluted Texas, let's say, with dirty air and people are getting sick in Texas, it would be completely fair for Texas or the US to say stop and pay. And so the moral argument is a human being who's born in, let's say, Central African Republic or Mozambique isn't worth less than a human being who's born in Montreal or New York. All human beings are worthy of respect. And if people are hurt, the hurting should stop and compensation is due. We can talk about amounts. But that's the moral argument, that if one nation harms another, there's wrongdoing, and as a matter of justice, less or no more. The strategic argument is that if the United States has a climate policy where the social cost of carbon is the domestic number, it participates in a system in which everyone does that, and all nations are losers. So whether you believe in the climate change problem at all or believe that it's real serious, let's just go with it for a moment. If the nations of the world all choose the domestic number, then all nations are losers. If China chooses the domestic number, if Russia chooses the domestic number, if Brazil chooses the domestic number, and they're going to be choosing a number, by the way, if only implicitly by whatever climate change policy they devise, then Americans are hurt. So the choice of the global number for the social cost of carbon, which is the damage done by a ton of carbon emissions, is part of a process by which other countries do the same, from which the United States is ultimately a winner. So the moral argument doesn't speak in terms of domestic self-interest. It speaks in terms of what's fair and just. The strategic argument speaks in terms of reciprocity. And the notion is the U.S. using the global number is an ingredient toward a situation in which all nations do that. And that's not farcical. We saw when the United States chose the global number, a bunch of countries in Europe, Canada too, saying we'll do that as well. So the United States use of the global number, which has been, I think, the majority practice over the past years since 2009, the choice of the global number has helped protect Americans from negative consequences from the emissions of other countries. And if you're thinking, well, we have flooding and wildfire, that's completely right. But the damage done and the risks associated with flooding and wildfire and drought, et cetera, are less than they would otherwise be, to the extent that other countries have chosen the global number in deciding to scale back their emissions.
Okay, and can you talk about, you kind of described the justice three ways, and maybe I was wondering if you could kind of tick down that list briefly, the sort of just distributive, corrective, rough. I think, of course, rough is probably where we'll end up.
Rough is where we end up.
Right.
Okay, so this gets very tricky, and I should say I've fundamentally changed my views over the course of the last 14 years, like I've done a U-turn. Let me give the distributive justice and corrective justice arguments and say what I thought and what I think now, and that'll get us there. So the distributive justice argument is some countries are poor, other countries are wealthy. If someone who's poor gets a little money from someone who's rich, social welfare increases. And the social welfare word isn't at all fancy. It's just that $10 to someone who has no money is real money. $10 to someone who has $1 billion is nothing at all. So if you transfer money from rich countries to poor countries, the argument is you increase social welfare. And I think that's true, acknowledging that you need to make sure that the poor countries aren't dissipating the money, let's say in the hands of corrupt leaders, or they're using the money for good. But bracketing that, let's assume, then we have increase in social welfare because the poor deserve the money more than the rich, to the extent that you care about what the size of the welfare pie is. Now, independent of that, there's a distributive justice argument, which is that, look, the fact that some of us got born in the United States or some of us got born to parents who could give us an opportunity isn't morally relevant compared to those who really got born in terrible situations. So there's a fairness argument apart from the aggregate welfare argument. Okay, so that's distributive justice. Then there's corrective justice, which says one person harms another, they should stop or pay. And this is well established in the law of civilized nations. And it applies if one company is next to you, let's say, we hear a siren in the background, that's a corrective justice siren, let's just stipulate, where the police are stopping wrongdoing. I hope it's not terrible wrongdoing, but there we go. So corrective justice is about stopping wrongdoing. And there the argument would be wealthy nations or high polluting nations have done wrong to vulnerable countries, and that's creates a claim for economic health and for stopping or reducing. I used to think those arguments sounded better than they were, and in the end they failed. And the reason is that there are plenty of people in poor countries who aren't poor, and there are plenty of people in wealthy countries who aren't rich. So the analogy to the individual fails. And my parents, and maybe yours, either didn't contribute to climate change much, or even if they did, they weren't wrongdoers. They didn't intend to harm anybody. They might not even, in the case of my parents, I don't think they were even plausibly negligent. They were just living their lives. And to call people who are responsible for climate change wrongdoers in the same sense as in tort law is a little harsh and a little false. So the analogy is imperfect, let's say. I used to think the analogy was so imperfect that it failed. I no longer think that. I think that the justice argument from the standpoint of corrective justice is close enough, and it marches hand in hand with the distributive justice argument, such that as a matter of rough justice, those in wealthy countries, let's say Germany, to make it less provocative than if we said the United States, those in wealthy countries who are responsible, just literally, for the harms done in nations that are particularly vulnerable, have a moral obligation to reduce and to help.
Right. There's a comment that is coming in from Ed Carr, a wonderful scientist working, an IPCC author. I want to kind of get it up here because it gets at some of these questions. And I just put up a clip from a story I did in 2009 from the climate talks in Copenhagen, where George Soros proposed kind of a financial instrument for accomplishing some of what you're talking about, a fee that's one of these like almost invisible fees on international transactions that could move a lot of money the way you're talking about. In the book, you get into some ideas also for how to actually do this, but we'll get to that when I get to the epilogue. So here's Ed Carr, who's now at the Stockholm Environment Institute, U.S. base, and I just joined the board there, so I have to disclose that. He says, "Hi, Andy, I appreciate the very clear articulation of moral responsibilities in terms of different kinds of justice and the smart framing of the social cost of carbon at a global scale, but these arguments have been employed for a long time to little or no impact on politics and policy. What's different now? What is the angle that will finally give these arguments traction?" Which is, I guess, what I just was kind of talking about. So what could you just sort of distill what might be different now? Maybe taking into account the turmoil of this moment, if we get through this moment?
It's a great question. So for 12 of the last 17 years, the arguments were decisive and succeeded. So that's the majority of the last 17 years. In federal court, the use of the global number was upheld, easily. The Court of Appeals said this is straightforward, it's lawful. In federal court, the rejection of the global number in favor of the domestic number was roundly, a very agitated court ruling, said this is unlawful and arbitrary, and struck it down. So the courts have founded authoritative rulings in favor of the global number and against the domestic number. That's where the law stands. Might shift, but that's where the law stands. In nations all over the world, the global number has been chosen, Actually, I'm not aware of any nation in the world except ours that said that the domestic number is preferable and that has tried to defend the use of the domestic number. Ours is the only one that's tried to use the domestic number, and it was struck down in federal court, which didn't perceive this as a hard question. Now, that's one set of answers, but I think it doesn't do justice to the question. This is a long game. And if you look at moral arguments with respect to various, they take a while to permeate. And, you can take your pick. Abigail Adams said, "Remember the ladies," and John Adams didn't give a very enthusiastic response. And, we have a lot more in the way of sex equality than would have been fathomable back in the time of Abigail and John Adams. So we, hope that the moral arguments prevail. If I may, the sexual harassment wasn't even a thing. It was a thing. It wasn't a concept. It was a practice, but it wasn't a concept until relatively recently. And now it's against the law. Not that it doesn't happen, but it's against the law.
Right.
So, in the long run, optimism.
The long arc of.
And it's been pretty short. So the idea that you started writing, you say, decades ago, the idea that our energy mix, think about energy efficiency and appliances, think about coal and solar and wind, think about automobiles in the United States. My gosh, and the United States isn't where it should be, but the fuel economy of automobiles in the United States is astounding compared to where it was in 2005.
Right. This is true for sure. So chapter 3 in the book is, in large part about another kind of distribution, not geographic or demographic, but intergenerational, and that we owe the future. Your valuation of the future is pretty high. You basically say it's the same, I believe, if I got the argument right. David Roberts, I love this piece he did when he was at Grist a long time ago, acknowledging how hard it is to talk about things like discount rates. He peppered his story with otter pictures randomly. But his key point was, a lot of this is social and ethical disputes being waged under cover of math. And I think what you're doing is actually elevating the moral argument but you still use numbers. And sometimes that's where some of these debates come in. By the way, to me, they actually, this is the same. There's a distracting quality to the big arguments, even in the grand climate questions, like how much is the climate system sensitive to double CO2, climate sensitivity. Even the experts still rage about this, let alone the ones who want to just stall any action. And I think if we get too caught up in the precision conveyed with the numbers, we can end up missing the boat, the importance for rough action. Can you talk about that a little bit? You have this section on the future. You say the benefits of emissions reductions will be enjoyed actually almost entirely in the future rather than the present, for CO2 at any rate.
Yeah, completely. Okay, so let's say that the principal beneficiaries of reductions over the next 5 years will not be you and me, but will be our children and grandchildren. What's the discount rate that we should apply to the benefits that they enjoy? First submission, kind of the principal submission, as you say, is that our grandchildren aren't worth less than we are, and our parents or grandparents aren't worth more than we are, that we should have a moral principle of intergenerational neutrality. Just as where you're born isn't morally relevant, so when you're born isn't morally relevant. So future people shouldn't be discounted compared to current people. So let's take off the table arguments for discounting that treat future persons as worth less. Now, it's still the case that future money is worth less. If you were asked, would you rather have $1 today or $1 in 10 years? I hope you'd say $1 today. And that might be impatience or pure time preference, but it's easiest to defend that $1 today can be invested and made to grow. So $10 in the 10 years from now is just worth less. So then the discounting issue starts to get pretty straightforward. The risk-free rate of return is a really good start. So if the risk-free rate of return now is around 2 or 3%, then we have a discount rate. And we're not discounting future persons. We're recognizing that future resources are worth less than present resources. And then then the machinery goes whir, and the social cost of carbon is spit out using a 2 or 3% discount rate.
Okay. I want to bring up, I actually reached out to Noah Kaufman to see if he might be able to pop on, a Columbia University energy analyst who has said we have to get over the social cost of carbon as a measure, as a core policy instrument. He has a piece he just posted recently about this. And Paul Kelleher has a book out about that kind of gets at the limits of these kinds of approaches. Have you dug in much on their arguments, and any quick thoughts before we get back into the book?
Yeah, the Kelleher argument book, I know. I think it's a superb book. And the questions about the social cost of carbon's empirical foundation are completely fair. The idea of dispensing with the social cost of carbon seems to me a little like the idea of dispensing without legs if you want to walk. What are you going to do? So we're reducing emissions, let's say, a lot or a little or not at all. What's the benefit or the cost of all those things? And without a social cost of carbon, we have no idea. So, okay, so let's say you're a climate change hawk, meaning you want to do a lot about it. A lot isn't very precise. So do you want to reduce emissions from automobiles by X, or by 2X, or by 3X? If you say 3X because you're a hawk, then you're implicitly assigning a value to the reduction. And what is the number based on? Right. So we might want to have an upper or lower bound on the social cost of carbon. We might want to resolve uncertainties in a particular way for reasons that we might articulate. Maybe we'd be precautionary, but not that precautionary. Maybe we wouldn't want to be precautionary, but I don't know. I mean, if you're a regulator, right, left, or center, zero could be the social cost of carbon. Even the Trump people, I think, are not saying zero. They're saying don't use it on what seems to me the opportunistic ground that it's just too hard to know what it is. But if you reduce prison rape, and that was something I was involved in with the government, you have to figure out what's the implicit cost of a prison rape. Or if you save a human life, you have to do that. And these are kind of searing, rape and human life. But if you don't assign a cost explicitly, you'll be doing it implicitly by the aggressiveness of the steps you take. And there you go. Thank you for the slide.
Yeah, and here we get into, again, this chapter 4 is about valuation. So I encourage people, by the way, to read the book, find the book and read the book, Climate Justice. And then we get to adaptation. I think you and I probably have some differences on adaptation. But talk a little bit about the key messages here.
On valuing life, or about adaptation?
Briefly on valuing life, and then we'll get into adaptation.
Okay, so suppose you have a regulation. Let's put climate change to one side. You may know that, I hope you do, every car in the United States has to have a camera in it so you can see behind. That was a regulation I was involved in. I love it even more now than I did when I got to work on it. And the question is that worth it? It's costly. not crazy costly, but it's costly to put those cameras in the car. You're going to save X number of lives. Is it worth the cost to save X number of lives? You're going to have to value human life to figure out whether it's what is worse. And we're actually valuing statistical risks, not lives. So a risk of 1 over X is worth how much? There we go. Thank you for that paper, which has been read by approximately 2 people, including me.
Maybe some more will read it now.
Okay, but I really enjoyed writing it. It's about rear visibility in cars, so you can see behind.
Yeah.
And the current number the U.S. government uses is $13 million, approximately. And that $13 million number reflects the best available research we have about how much people demand to face a risk of, let's say, 1 over 10,000. How much are they demanding from what such data as we have? And if all this is making you feel creeped out, that's a very large club. I feel creeped out about it too. But we can't avoid it, because if people are being asked to spend real money to reduce the risk of 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000, then we shouldn't ask them to spend more than they're willing to pay. Maybe they want to spend the money on something, for their children or for their summer. Okay, so that's how we get the number. How much do people demand to face a statistical risk?
Briefly on that point before we get away from cars, was there headwinds? Not headwinds, the opposite of headwinds, tailwinds on that, because I assume insurers were eager for the sort of reduced accident rate generally, not just the human mortality.
I was in government on this as a kind of figure it out person rather than think about politics. And President Obama actually told me, do what's best given all the information you have, and I'll worry about the politics. So this one we decided, though it wasn't great on cost benefit grounds, there were a lot of benefits we couldn't quantify very well, like people aren't backing up into their own kids, which is like the worst you could imagine. And there's one thing very cool is that there's increased convenience of driving. And I didn't see it as visibly then as I do now with the camera in the car. And the Council of Economic Advisors said, we don't know what the value is of being able to see better when you're parking and backing up. But if it's worth at least $50 to a year, this regulation is going to be golden. They said, and surely it's worth at least $50 a year. But take this valuing life issue as focusing on how much we get from saving lives, and emphasizing in this chapter that if you're poor, you shouldn't be worth less than people who are rich. So it has a principle of equality, even though if you're rich, you're willing to pay more to avoid statistical risks than people are poor because you have a lot of money.
Yeah, and that slides pretty neatly into the adaptation finance arena. Setting aside climate, in the past, I examined the Global Fragility Index. Like, there's people who look at fragile states, and it's so clear. And here we have Trump dismantling USAID. It's so clear that if you invest for not just resilience, but just general capacity in places that are struggling, you're creating a landscape that is less likely to break out in conflict and things that can kick back. So there's a self-interest argument for these kinds of investments as well. But maybe you could just state briefly the adaptation imperative.
Okay, so let's start, shall we, with the United States? When I got into the Department of Homeland Security under President Biden, I noticed that the Trump administration had created a program called the BRIC program, roughly building resilient infrastructure in communities. And it's a grant program that's fiercely competitive, where places all over the country compete to get resources to be more resilient against weather-related risks, including flooding and wildfire and drought, etc. And all credit to the Trump administration for creating the program. And you can see this funding program as one of a host of tools for creating more in the way of resilience or improving adaptation. One is just information, giving people clarity about extreme heat and what to do to protect themselves against it. That we see that all over the world, emphatically, including the United States. Maybe in the next weeks in the United States, I hope not, but maybe. Then there's flood risks, which you can reduce through various building measures. There are wildfire risks, which you could also reduce through building measures. And so there's informational interventions. Then there's also economic grants and USAID, which is close to home for me because my wife, Samantha Power, ran USAID. As you say, the idea of giving resources, and we're not Santa Claus, so not limitless resources, but giving resources or technical assistance to help places be more resilient in the face of climate-related risk through economic instruments. That's super important. Then there's also a set of instruments that are regulatory. So you could have a flood standard or something else that is helpful against risks. So regulatory, economic incentives, and information are three sets of tools. There's nudging also, nudging involving, let's say, choice architecture, where the architecture of a place, I think Tulsa's done pretty well on this. So Tulsa has some architecture where if it's hot, people can go various places. And that's also protection. And this sounds kind of abstract and maybe not as exciting as emissions reductions. But there are some places in the world where if there's extreme heat, people are going to be fine. And there are other places in the world where if there's extreme heat, people are going to die. So right. The stakes are very high.
By the way, what you just said is true right in the same city. There's some places in Portland, Oregon, where people are air conditioned. And I have done several sessions on this, including with scientists who study this. And Christy Ebi at the University of Washington said to me, "No one needs to die in a heat wave." She said this to me like 3 times. And the capacities are not expensive either, but they involve... and it's not just federal. I think there's an opportunity there for us all to have a vulnerability day where we look around and say, well, who is vulnerable to heat? It's the old couple who can't afford to run their air conditioner. And that leads me to a certain sense of optimism, too. By the way, I just saw recently that I think a judge has initially challenged this brick dismantling that, as you said, he's dismantling something his previous administration created.
Program. And I kind of wish there were more engagements with the president on this, because the BRIC program is something he should really be proud of. It wasn't created by Obama. It wasn't created by Trump. I mean, it was created by Trump. It wasn't created by Biden. And and you can believe in the BRIC program even if climate change is something you're uncertain about. So you can think resilience is important in the face of weather-related risks, even if I'm agnostic about whether the risks are climate-induced or skeptical of that. I still don't want wildfire and flooding and extreme heat to be causing suffering. And it has a prevention rather than cure feature. Of course, the ultimate prevention would be less in the way of climate change, in my view. But if you have a place that's resilient, then the harm is reduced even when the bad thing like flooding kicks in.
Yeah, so let's dig in a little more on adaptation and maybe including at the international scale. But I have a problem even with the word, because adaptation implies we're adapting to climate change. And when you look carefully around the world, much of what we see in terms of losses is actually vulnerability to today's climate, let alone what's coming. The thing on the right here is this. I made a wishful welcome wagon guide for people moving to Florida. There are like 800 people still moving every day to Florida in toto. And what that is a map of all the hurricane and tropical storm tracks over Florida. You can't even see the state. And I went in 2016 to both Singapore and Nairobi just by chance, different meetings when I was still a high carbon person. And 80 miles from the equator, you've got Singapore's Gardens by the Bay, an air-conditioned place where there's like olive trees growing 80 miles from the equator. And then I was in a slum, an unplanned settlement in Nairobi where there's barely any water and electricity, and it's all sewage. And so the vulnerabilities are implicit. And unless we broaden how we think of the word adaptation to include adapting to today's climate, not to mention historic mega droughts, et cetera, it feels problematic to me. But it's a word that I think it's gotten too cemented as, and I think if you detach from climate change, then there's lots more that can be discussed with people who might just bridle at talking about climate change. I don't know what you think.
Okay, this is great, and it's completely fair. I'll tell you an inside story, shall I, in government?
Totally.
This was something that just shocked me, but I now see the wisdom of the person who shocked me. We were working on something involving adaptation in the government, and the word climate change appeared in various places in the document. And the civil servant with whom I was working said, "Don't use the word climate change." And I was working in a position where I got to kind of decide. I was a political person, not very political by nature, but the person was kind of rebelling and saying, "Don't use the word climate change," and civilly, very civilly. But I thought, can't use the word climate change, or you don't want us to use the U.S. government to use climate change? And I said, why? And they said, well, if Trump comes in, they're going to destroy the document if he uses climate change. But if it doesn't use the word climate change, it doesn't have any partisan valence. It's about, whatever. If it's about flooding or about extreme heat, it's or whatever's happening in Florida, it's not
right.
a valence. And I thought, oh, that's a good point. So I think we didn't use the word climate change. I take your point on adaptation. If it seems like this is our grandchildren rather than us, that's really misleading. You're also right. I think that the word is familiar and kind of part of the system. There's a technical definition of resilience, which is different from adaptation. It's a little elusive, but protection against climate-related risks is what we're thinking about. And if we don't like that, because
right.
protection against weather-related risks, it's really important that people not die or lose their homes in Los Angeles, whether or not climate change is responsible for wildfire.
Right, exactly. And gosh, I've written so much about the wildfire issue. That's a whole nother day. The vulnerabilities created by building lots of wooden structures in Colorado or in Pacific Palisades.
Completely, and that's an opportunity as well as a potential tragedy, where we know what to do, and if the risk is one of hurricanes, there are things we can do.
Yep, absolutely. So the consumer, us, each of us, you have a nice chapter on the choices we make, and you bring up the concept of choice engine. Right now, the engine is mostly consumptive advertising that we're immersed in. But you point to something that Trump is trying to expunge. I think the federal codes showing you which washing machine is more efficient. And then you have what Zillow and others are doing in the real estate sector, which I find very interesting. Climate risk data is being an implicit part of what you look at when you're thinking about buying a home. So just talk a little bit about what a better choice engine would look like. You mentioned AI, some positive aspects of it, and let's get into that. And by the way, do you have time to go a little past the hour?
Sure, definitely.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so suppose someone is buying an appliance and they want it to be the best appliance given what they care about. It's a little hard to figure that out. You're buying a microwave oven. You might look at a website that lists the best ones and you might trust it and just go there. But it might be that what you care about isn't the focus of the trusted source. So suppose there was a choice engine. It could be an AI-driven choice engine where you say, I want a microwave oven that is going to last a long time, and that has the lowest carbon emissions. Or I want to buy an automobile which has the following features and that is really good in terms of fuel economy. And if we all had that, that would be fantastic for our own consumption values. And if we all had that, the choice engine could either connect with our environmental concerns if we had them, or it could by default, if we wanted the one that by default focused on environmental concerns, would tend to that, or it could turn it off. Now, because environmental harms are an externality, I would favor at least a modicum of direction in favor of consideration of the environmental harm. But if you don't like that, if you're more libertarian, then let people figure it out. In any case, this is a great gain to consumers and potentially a very significant gain to environmental values. We need those choice engines. We don't have them yet.
Yeah, and how much of that ends up being government responsibility, or where does the corporate world come in on its own? It's kind of, as you know, it's a circular thing. It's like companies can't pursue sustainable shrimp production if consumers go to the market and can't find a clear, reliable label about which shrimp is better to buy if you buy shrimp.
I'd love
to break that loop.
Yeah. I'd love the government to provide some. There are a couple problems. First, it takes resources. Second, the government might not be good at it. Third, the government might not want to do it. By the way, as your question makes me think of the best lawyer's advice I ever heard, and I heard it really recently, from a professor named Archibald Cox, who was famous in the Watergate era, who was also a great Solicitor General. He argued beautifully in front of the Supreme Court of the United States. And he was asked, what made you such a successful advocate to the Supreme Court? And he said, well, here's what I have to say. First, you have to make them want to agree with you. Second, you have to show them how. And that's very generalizable. So with respect to climate things, first, we have to get people to want to agree. And second, we have to show them how to act given their agreement. Now, choice engines can do both. But if the government has a choice engine, there may be suspicion that its numbers aren't reliable. There might be actual illicit motivation on the part of government. On the other hand, I think there's completely a place for it on the part of the non-politicals in the government. A private effort or 1,000 private efforts, really good to provide choice engines. And we're seeing some of them. What we haven't seen is choice engines that are climate attuned. And to anyone who's listening to this, immense profit opportunity. You're going to get rich and you're going to get into heaven, which is a good twofer.
That is a good prospect then. And let's get to the epilogue. This is from theory to practice. You do say, again, one of your key points is about the moral argument for cosmopolitanism, for global valuation, global thinking, global investment. And you get into other issues too. I'm showing here a wonderful graphic from Roman Krznarek, who's an ethicist, a philosopher in England, who's written a lot about how to be a good ancestor and that kind of thing. And he talks about how we are swamped by the generations yet to come, that all the people who died in the last 50,000 years, or 100 billion people, when he did the graphic, there were 7.7 billion of us. And then unborn generations, the next 50,000 years could be in the trillions. So he's kind of making the point, one of the points you make. You have temporal valuation and geographic and developmental. How do you summarize your takeaway?
Well, the principle of neutrality across space and time. So where you're born and when you're born are not matters of moral relevance. And, to make this resonate, you maybe need a picture of people in a poor country who are struggling from climate related horror, or you can go to Texas. And if you're born in Texas, you know, you deserve more vulnerability than if you're born in Maine. I love both states, and I don't think
Yeah.
people in either have a moral claim greater than that of people elsewhere. Also, if you see pictures of people born in 2067, are they worth less than people born in 1967? That's very hard to defend.
Yeah, I'm showing a slide from another talk I've given. That's my sister's former apartment stove in New York City. Very small, efficient apartment, super efficient city living, great. And this was a woman I met in rural India when I was writing about clean cooking, another issue I know you've focused on in the past. And, you know, anyone who says we need to do X on energy or on any of these issues is missing that the we is doing a lot of work.
Right, completely.
Keep.
And, you know, I'm not prescriptive about the amount of money that we should pay to poor countries. That's a mixture of a theoretical question and a practical question. But the existence of a moral obligation is extremely straightforward.
Yeah, it seems true. But there is a counter argument here. Well, a couple. You know, I'm just going to play devil's advocate. One is that who are we to make a judgment about what the future generations need? You know, if you're a fossil fueler, actually, the current Chris Wright, the current energy secretary, is all about energy poverty reduction, but he's not about climate, the climate component. And he would say we need to make people as less poor as possible, as quickly as possible, so they can enjoy the fruits of modern life and be productive in society. So that's the current
Yeah,
time argument.
I
And
love.
then the other one is the future. You know, shouldn't we liberate the future from our constraints of what we think the future needs?
I love the idea that we want economic growth because that's a very good thing for our children and grandchildren. So all applause to him for putting a spotlight on that. If our grandparents and great grandparents had decided to have, let's say, a circular economy and not to produce things that involved pollution and others, that wouldn't be very good for us. So economic growth is very good for future generations. And that's one reason the social cost of carbon is a thing to dance in the streets about, because the social cost of carbon doesn't say we're going to degrowth at all. It says we're going to incorporate the cost of what we do. Now, what's the cost of a ton of greenhouse gas emissions? It isn't infinite, not close to infinite. It isn't zero, not close to zero. Is it $100? Well, that's pretty reasonable. Is it 200? That's probably reasonable too, maybe a little high. Is it six? That's kind of ridiculously low. And now we're figuring it out. And if this seems like a kind of technical, unimportant exercise, what reductions we make depend on that figure. And that's taking on board the idea economic growth is something good for future generations, but economic growth that doesn't consider the negative effects of climate change on them isn't in their interest.
That's fair to say. I want to. Obama keeps coming to mind to me in doing something, trying something that I think Biden failed at in climate policy, which was sort of a realism in the context of the variegated nature of America. And I'm going to play. I don't know if you were there. This was the. Oh no, this is
Very important
2016.
for those of us who care deeply about this, and Catherine is a wonderful example of the right way to do it, to not be dismissive of people's concerns when it comes to what will this mean for me and my family, right? So if you're a working class family and dad has to drive 50 miles to get to his job, and he can't afford to buy a Tesla or a Prius, and you know the most important thing to him economically to make sure he can pay the bills at the end of the month is the price of gas. And when gas prices are low, that means an extra $100 in his pocket or $200 in his pocket, and that may make the difference about whether or not he can buy enough food for his kids. You know, if you just start lecturing him about climate change and what's going to happen to the planet 50 years from now, it's just not going to register. So part of what we have to do, I think, is to engage, talk about the science, talk about the concrete effects of climate change. We have to make it visual and we have to make it vivid in ways that people can understand. But then we also have to recognize that this transition is not going to happen overnight, and you're not starting from scratch. People are locked into existing ways of doing business. Look, part of the reason we have such a big carbon footprint is our entire society is built around interstate highway systems and cars. And we can't overnight suddenly just start having everybody taking high-speed trains because we don't have any high-speed trains to take.
So I just thought it was spectacular bit of realism. And of course, the progressives, climate hawks, carbon hawks, I call them because they're more about carbon than climate risk, really punished the all of the above argument. Biden wasn't willing to push back on that crew enough, to my mind. I'm an opinion writer now. And I don't know, I just thought this really was quite something, especially speaking directly to Leo DiCaprio, who's very much an activist on these issues. And do you see, looking at Trump, Chris Wright, and what Obama was about, and then what comes next, do you have your own sense of a message that can kind of carry through in a way that's productive for climate and for people across maybe a little wider swath of us?
Well, I do like all of the above, and the idea that we're going to be off coal in the near future, I think that's not a good idea, and it's not realistic either. I have an idea about what I think is the right policy, how to frame it. I feel more out of my depth on. I think the right policy is one that's extremely focused, as you're suggesting, on all of the effects of our policies, including negative effects on people who need low gas prices and who can't afford expensive electric cars. So the idea of a policy that's closely attuned to all effects. As you probably know, I love cost-benefit analysis, not as much as I love my Labrador retrievers, but they do belong in the same sentence. And so the right policy is one that's super attuned to costs and benefits. And President Obama was super attuned to costs and benefits. And I think that's in his comments. And that's because the human impact depends on what people are feeling. And that translates into a policy that is not making people ashamed, not punitive, super focused on the negative effects, potentially, of climate-informed policies on people who aren't doing so great, and trying to attenuate or eliminate those negative impacts.
Well, there you go. Let's hope some of that can emerge from what has to be described as wreckage right now, both in terms of our capacity to do the international investments that would be required, whether or not you just even use the word climate, to create a world with less risk and more possibility. And the same thing within our nation. It's been great to have you on the show. Maybe we could do a part 2 sometime soon. Because we're just scratching the surface of some important issues here. And also I got to go kayaking because it's high tide. I live here by the tide more than the clock.
Wow.
And in down East Maine, in Wabanaki land. So thank you, Cass Sunstein of Harvard University, a prolific author with your book coming out, another book coming out later this year on manipulation. We'll have to get to that down the line. This is a fresh look at climate justice, injustice, and Trump 2.0. And as soon as we're done, you can share whatever link you've been watching on with anyone to propagate the conversation. And that's it for this edition of Sustain What? I'm Andy Revkin. Hold on a second.